Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of MI for Change. I'm your host, Dr. Monica Gilbert, and today we're going to talk about leadership and motivational interviewing. And I want to start off with an anecdote. A couple years ago, before I knew what I know now about motivational interviewing, I was working with a parent. And when I was working with a parent, I noticed that a lot of her goals were tied to the child's academic skills. However, the child needed a lot of social support. And although he did have the precursors to learn these skills, they were never targeted. And mom just wanted to work on academics and math and all those things, which I understand they are important. But we were leaving this off, this very important piece of the child's abilities to learn these social skills so they can use them whenever they wanted to make friends and socialize with others. So I was providing parent training with mom every week. And I remember the last session prior to what I'm going to go over today happened. And we were just talking about different things. And I told mom, well, social skills are really important. And mom was like, uh-huh, yeah. And I'm like, yeah, because, you want him to make friends and you want him to, in the future, have a job and meet other people and just do all these things. And she was like, yeah, for sure, for sure. And I was like, yeah, and academic skills are really important too, but social skills, I mean, whenever you're working with someone, you need to have social skills. And she was like, yeah, for sure, definitely. But mom never changed any of the goals that she wanted to work on. There were, even after that conversation, which I thought was pretty convincing, she didn't budge. All of her goals wanted to be around academics. So this naturally happened where the teacher asked mom and myself to go to the school and observe the child. And we went to the recess to observe him. We were actually going to lunch because he had a lot of maladaptive behaviors there, but then we made it to recess. And when we were in recess, we were just observing the child. And you can tell that something happened that day. I was just like staring at mom as she looked at her child playing by himself with the leaves in a corner and looking and trying to see who he could play with. But again, he didn't know, he didn't have the skills, he didn't know how to initiate play. And I could almost see a tear coming down from her eyes when she saw that. Well, after that session, she called me up and she said, let's start working on social skills. So that motivated her to start working on social skills. And that brings me into, you're probably wondering, like, what does this have to do with leadership? Well, it has a lot to do with leadership because we're talking about motivation. And when we are in a leadership role, we often think about, well, how do we get this person motivated to do this? And we throw that word motivation around. But what does motivation really mean? Well, for me, and the way that I see it now, learning more about motivation and skills and people in general, it has to tie to the person's values. If that person doesn't see that skill as valuable, they're less likely to do it. Sure, you may get short term compliance, but is that what you really want? No, you want to get buy in. So you have to have those conversations to first identify what are these values that this RBT or this staff has, and how do we tie it together, or how do we tie it to the values that we have as an organization or as a supervisor. So going back to the anecdote of the parent, what happened that day? Well, that day she saw the value. She saw the skills tied to her values, and her values were to see her child happy, to see her child form relationship with others, and seeing her child there made her realize that. Now, we don't have to take RBTs to the scenarios. We don't have to take our staff to those scenarios. We can use communication to get them there mentally. And again, we want them to first identify what their values are and see if there's congruencies with the organization or the supervisor's values. And then from there, we can see the magic happen. All right, so let's get into leadership. So, when we see resistance, and I know that I've spoken in other podcasts about not using the word resistance, but instead using discord. But for those of you who are new here, I like to use the word resistance because Whenever you say resistance, everyone kind of gets a picture of what it looks like. So whenever there's resistance in a treatment plan or an organization, it's not just inconvenient, it can be risky, it can be dangerous. For example, as a supervisor, if my RBT, if my intern supervisee is being resistant to the treatment plan, meaning they're engaging in these resistant behaviors or resisting against implementing whatever it is that I want them to implement, whether it's taking data or implement this treatment with fidelity, then it definitely is risky for the client. It's risky for me because they're under my certification. And even for them, what are they learning? So again, it's not only inconvenient, but it can be risky. As an organization, a lot of processes fall through the cracks when staff aren't implementing things the way that they should. We have more therapist attrition. We have more client attrition. So clients leave. There's a higher staff turnover. And there can also be a burnout in supervisors and other people that are working with the therapists and the staff. So there are different reasons why we see that pushback. But the main core of why that is because something is going on. There's this incongruency with the person's values and the value that is being portrayed in that organization or in that supervision. So we see a lot of the pushback looking like something like, well, I don't have time to take the data because I'm focused on the client's skills, which is true. It's great that this RBT, that this intern is focusing on client skills, we also understand how important data is. So, in that case, there needs to be this congruency or this tied together with the therapist's values and motivation and what we think is important for the client as well. Some other supervisees or staff think, well, I know how to do this. Why do I have to listen to you? And they won't tell you like that, although you do have some people that will tell you like that. But most of the time, they engage in these passive resistant behaviors. And you're able to see it in the session. So, with this staff, perhaps having a conversation about how do you feel in this supervision session? Because they may not feel like what they're saying is respected or is being acknowledged. We don't know until we know. And that's the truth. That's why having these conversations with open-ended questions and some affirmations and some reflections are really important. There's a quote, and I haven't found who said the quote, and maybe you guys can help me with that, but it says something like, how would you define the best intervention? It's the one that is actually going to be implemented. That's really the best intervention. As a BCBA, you can come up with this kick-ass plan and like have all of the data and have all of these procedures and all of this empirical support. But if your RBT isn't doing it, you crash. As a business owner, you can also have all these processes organized and structured and everything in its place. But if the staff don't engage in these processes, it crashes. So again, we need to get to that core. We need to get to that motivation to help them with it. And the way that we get there is through those conversations. Now, I want you all to do this mini self assessment of yourselves because through these self assessments, and this is what I do with a lot of the organizations that I do the motivational interviewing trainings for, I have them just ask themselves this question. And believe it or not, these questions are just, they evoke so many thoughts, they evoke so much information. So the first question is, how often do your supervisees generate their own solutions without you prompting them? And if you're an owner of a company or in the leadership role of that company, you can, instead of supervisees, staff. So, how often do your staff generate their own solutions without you prompting them? I want you to think about that for a second. All right, next question. How much of your supervision time is spent correcting versus collaborating? And again, if you're working in the leadership role, how much of your time leading is spent in correcting versus really collaborating with that staff? Next question. How often do staff agree in the room, but implement inconsistently later? So in the room, they're like, or in the meeting, they're like, yeah, that's great. Sounds like a plan, of course. But there's no action. It doesn't happen. And usually it's followed by a bunch of excuses. Oh, I had no time, or I didn't realize this. Next question. How often do you leave thinking, why am I still having this conversation? We've had this conversation over and over, and I'm frustrated. Why are we still having this conversation? How often does that happen? How often do conversations end with commitment language? I'll try, I'm ready. If you weren't there to push, would things still move forward? And this is a very important last question because it talks about not only that prompt dependency, which sometimes happens. And I have to admit, as the owner of a company, I do this sometimes. I engage in this or I fall into this. But if you weren't there, would everything just crash? Because being the owner of the company, that doesn't help you scale. That's not what you want. You want the company to act independently. Same thing as a supervisor. You are going to continue to provide a supervision, but what happens when you aren't there, when you're sick? Is the progress of the implementation and of the child itself and of everything, is that all dependent on you? Because that is a burden to carry. That is very heavy. So if you weren't there to push, would things still move forward? And if you answered no, then it's important to reflect on why not. So, again, these questions are meant to really help brainstorm and really think about the processes that you have now, the interactions and the communication that you have with your staff. I've been in a place where I've had a very creative staff member that is great at doing what she does. However, it is so difficult sometimes to get her to engage in a more structured in a more structured work, which we all need some structure at least in our life and in work. And in that situation, I have felt very frustrated. I have felt like, what do I do? Like, I've had this conversation over and over. I don't want to let them go because I see what they're bringing to the table. And it's gotten to a point of several conversations and several contingencies being placed. But again, that made me think about focusing back on the value. And when I had this last conversation with this staff member, this was a couple years ago, I remember telling her, well, tell me about what are you looking what is the impact that you're looking to have in this position that you have in our corporation? And that was a very direct, but also very thought provoking question, open ended question. And she started thinking about it. She's like, impact. She said, well, I want the kiddos to really improve in their behaviors. I want them to have fun. I want to see more interaction from the therapist to the parents. I want to grow within the company. So there she was telling me all of her values. And I was able to tie a lot of those values to our organizational values as well. And they were congruent, they were the same. We were just speaking in different languages and we weren't understanding each other. So we were speaking in the same language, just metaphorically, we were speaking in different languages. And when we were able to her outline her values and in that exercise, in that meeting I had with her, I outlined the values of the company as well. And we looked at them, we're like, it's the same thing. Now, how do we get there? How do we merge this so we can get to that place? And there was improvements. I'm not going to say that it was like 100% improvements, but from the conversation, I saw more improvements than the past conversations where I had contingencies lined up and this is based on your bonus and blah, blah. None of that was reinforcing. None of that was working. But when we were able to get to those values, that's really what worked. So I invite you all to think about that, to restart this podcast where you listen to the questions again and pause it and really reflect on those core questions because it's so important. And you can even use it with your RBTs. You can use it with your interns, supervisees, or with the staff. And you will see how one little seed creates this growth. And sometimes that's all that's needed. All we have to do is just plant that seed, step back, and allow it to do its work. Thank you for being here with me today. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I will see you next time. Thank you for joining me on today's episode of MI for Change. If you're ready to keep growing your motivational interviewing skills, I'd love to invite you to explore my MI Academy, where you'll find a full library of on-demand courses designed to help you put MI into practice with confidence. You can learn more at www.drmonicagilbert.com. Until next time.